Hi everyone, welcome to the video on logical fallacies. Now, some of you might have encountered a discussion of logical fallacies uh, in your Composition 1 class. Some may have not. That's okay. In thinking about the logical fallacies, you want to think about the rhetorical situation, but also those discussions about where there are gaps in our knowledge and understanding, okay? Through your current investigation on your conspiracy projects, you're taking a look at a couple of different communities, and we've talked about the mainstream versus the counterculture or that subculture community. And it has you taking a look at and investigating assumptions that are made in the narratives, norms and rules, attitudes and beliefs, those taboos, those things that are not usually looked at or said, and those appeals, those things that draw a person into a particular community, whether that be the mainstream dominant culture or that counterculture, that subculture in that community. And so we're looking at different arguable issues on all sides, okay? We've already started our investigation and talked about some of this with your rationale, but you've been making an inventory with these various communities and where you fit or belong. So you start to think about things on a local level, like where you fit, your family values, the campus community and dorm life. Those are some examples of that local community. But you're also keep in mind the global communities that exist, like the state, the nation, and the world. And so you've started that process of brainstorming where your conspiracy fits in those in that spectrum from local to global. And you think about the controversies that surround your particular conspiracy theory and that community, and you enlist your personal interest, your current knowledge level going in, and you think about the degree of engagement and participation that you've had so far with this particular subculture. You take a look at issues and in that conspiracy theory, and you try to explore different levels of disagreement that exist between that mainstream culture and the counterculture, okay? And you ask yourself questions like, what's at the heart of the disagreement between these communities? Is it about, are there disagreements about the facts? Is it about the beliefs or values? Are there costs and benefits to getting that information out with that subculture? So you start to evaluate some of those things, and then you kind of think about your situation, your stance, and you explore your own point of view, and you ask yourself questions like, what is my position on this conspiracy theory and why? Are there alternative points of views that I could have? And what is at stake with me investigating this conspiracy theory? And so you start to think about all of those questions, and you determine how much research that you'll want to do. A few, of course, will consult the instructor. You'll look at the assignment sheets and the rubrics. You'll look at the bibliographic research. You'll skim articles, and you'll have conversations with people with experience that have talked about these kinds of topics, or the subculture, the conspiracy theory, and you'll versus that mainstream. Then you'll look for alternative views to that conspiracy. So you'll start to formulate the larger goal or the larger purpose to your project, and create this governing question of why am I investigating this, and what do I hope to gain by investigating? So you'll start to earn your thesis and create a knowledgeable ethos. So you'll consult sources and add to your background. You'll consider all sides of the issue, and then eventually you'll offer some of your own evidence. So you'll start to look for ways to create your claims about this conspiracy and that narrative, and the folks that make help to create that narrative. And you'll use sound reason and support for your claims, but you'll also keep in mind that opposing view as well. Okay. So in thinking about our investigation, you want to understand that argument is two things. It's persuasion and it's truth seeking. So, and it's those things because truth relaxes our certainties, and persuasion asks us to be certain or to commit to the claims to get others to change their points of view. Okay, so you see, with your investigation of that subculture, that conspiracy, you have writing that as a process and a product. It's a process because you're going through a process of inquiry characterized by fact finding, information gathering, and considering multiple viewpoints. But it's a product in that you are going to be adding to that ongoing conversation. So it's important that you adopt that truth-seeking attitude. In order to do so, we need to recognize when people say and write things that don't necessarily align. And that's where those logical fallacies come in. Informal fallacies are instances of murky reasoning that can cloud an argument and lead to unsound conclusions. This can be done intentionally or unintentionally. So, but they are deceptive statements. They can be misleading. And one of the oldest examples that I can think of on the top of my head is, for a long time in our history, people believed that the world was flat for a very long time. Even like academics and scholars thought that the world was flat. And so it took time and some progress for this to be proven otherwise, right? And so, and now we just know that's erroneous reasoning, okay? Though some, even in our modern times, would want to debate this, okay? And so, again, you may have talked about logical fallacies in your Comp 1 class and or touched on it. There are hundreds of logical fallacies. Some you might recognize or and possibly have encountered in your own daily life, and others are less familiar, but I'm just going to kind of touch on a few of them, and I encourage you to go on the internet and investigate and look for some on your own. Okay, so this brings me to the first slide that you see up on the screen. So many people think about science being reliable, and so if it has the science, it must be true. Okay, but I want to read what's on the slide. A cloud is 90% water. A watermelon is 90% water. Therefore, since a plane can fly through a cloud, a plane can fly through a watermelon. Okay, something in that statement just doesn't land with most people that hear that out loud or read it. Logical fallacies are like that. It gives you kind of a gut check, like something just isn't right with this statement. And some are very obvious, but some are very subtle, okay? And when you take a look closely at the statements, okay, a cloud is 90% water, that's true. And a watermelon is 90% water, that's true, okay? But that conclusion does not really follow those facts, right? And so we see that faulty reasoning, okay? And if you try to investigate that a little more or think about it a little more, we know that watermelons have a dense outer skin and clouds are made of that water vapor. So they can't be, it's not a very good comparison, right? And so we see the flaw in that statement. And so that's what we're looking at when we talk about logical fallacies, okay? Oops, we got to move to the next slide. It doesn't want to move. There we go. So the next fallacy that we're going to talk about is the straw man fallacy. This is where someone will redefine an argument by taking the point or the claim and moving it to its extreme. So as you see with this comic strip, we have Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. They're two politicians. And you can see that Mitt Romney has taken out of context what President Obama had stated. Okay, it says in the comic, it says, "Stop editing my remarks to make it look like I hate business." And so he took part of it and just focused in on the last part of the statement. So not giving you that full picture. And it recharacterizes that other person that originally made the argument. So it's distorting or exaggerating a person's word to recharacterize them and take things out of context, right? And makes it a false projection of that person, okay? The next one is begging the question. And this assumes that the premise explains the conclusion, leaving people wondering how and why. So, and it just kind of perpetuates more questions, okay? And so I think therefore I am doesn't really answer the stance or the position. It just leaves you wondering, well, why, right? So it is a type of circular argument, and it just it doesn't really prove what you're asking. Which brings us to circular reasoning, okay? Circular reasoning, it's really difficult to argue with someone that uses this fallacy. The arguer will continually go back to the original premise for their conclusion in a very reductive way. And they truly, these types of people truly believe one way about something. So as you see with this meme, if ancient aliens didn't exist, then how did they build everything? And so it kind of goes back to that same argument about the aliens, right? And we kind of encountered that with the chariots of the gods in some places. But someone arguing would say something like, they would say, you know, that aliens built everything because aliens did it. And somebody arguing against them would say something like, well, how do you know they built everything? And they would reply, because aliens built everything. And so they just stick to what they believe and they keep repeating that same thing, okay? And that's circular reasoning. The next fallacy, and some of you might have encountered this fallacy before in your real life, but this sets up a false dichotomy or duality where there's only two choices, okay? And it assumes that there are only two outcomes possible, okay? And it's never really that simple. And so we've encountered the false dilemma or false dichotomy actually in real life. An example of this we see every 4 years. We see Republicans and Democrats on TV and then in the media, and they're projected as the one of only two choices, right? But obviously there are more choices than just Republicans and Democrats to vote for. There are independent parties or the Green Party, but we rarely hear about that from different politicians or in media. They're excluded from debates, right? So it's on us to investigate those alternative choices, right? Instead of just saying, well, there's only two choices, so we can only choose from those two, right? So it's so again, that's an example of our like a everyday kind of false dilemma fallacy. Okay. Another one is the slippery slope fallacy. Okay, and slippery slope is a favorite for conspiracy theorists, right? Take for instance, people that are about gun control. And sometimes they take it to that worst case scenario. So the slippery slope is that worst case scenario fallacy. Okay. If you take guns away, then all guns will be taken and it will create an Orwellian nightmare for our society. So you see that there is this compounding feeling or compounding argument, like a chain event of things could potentially happen. And that's what a slippery slope fallacy does. Okay, and it just kind of rolls on in this chain event of things to that worst case extreme. Okay. In the picture, you see that there are two advertisements, one for McDonald's and one for food stamps. And so those are visually exhibiting some examples of slippery slope. If you look at the food advertisement, some people might argue or believe that if you start eating those McDonald's French fries, eventually you'll become addicted to that food and you become overweight and end up like the Super Size Me guy. When really that's not always the case. People have their agency or choice to visit at McDonald's and portion things correctly, and it's not always assumed that you'll automatically become obese, and for just because you eat McDonald's. And then the top one is that conversation about food stamps. If you go on assistance, then you'll become dependent on the system, and therefore will create this cycle of dependency in your family. And we all know that there are many examples out there that are contrary to that, and that there are those folks that go on assistance temporarily, get college educated, and move on to successful careers. So it goes against these slippery slope fallacies. Okay, so those are just a few examples of talking about it and how we can counter that. The ad hominem fallacy. You want to think about this fallacy as the bullying fallacy. You see this with many political debates. And what you see with this cartoon, and I like to use cartoons a lot if you can't tell. And they use a lot of fallacies in the cartoons, which is interesting. So, excuse me. With the ad hominem fallacy, you see that the lobster and the shrimp are in a debate. And it makes the statement, can we let a shrimp like this run our great country? And so what this fallacy is showing that it's not really a conversation about the things like the issues or talking points, but the lobster is talking about the appearance or the characteristics and attributions of the person. Okay, so they're attacking the person instead of the substance of the debate, and that's what an ad hominem fallacy is. And so, and we've heard some of this in our own political arena. You've heard people call Trump about his hair, about his orange appearance. You hear many on Trump talk about Sleepy Joe, Shifty Shift, all of those things. And so they name call and they bully and they talk about their appearance rather than the real issues that matter. So that's the ad hominem fallacy. Faulty use of authority. Okay, what you see here is where you have a figure that an entertainer, a person of authority, might not have the credentials or dubious credentials about an argument, right? So we have Michael Jordan. This is an advertisement selling underwear, and he was paid to be a spokesman for this advertisement. And most people will run out and buy the product, right? Because we all like Michael Jordan as a basketball player and an entertainer. But if you step back from that and you think about what are his credentials and expertise on underwear, the quality of underwear, right? Does he know anything about clothing as an expert? And so probably not, right? So when we think about his role with that product, and so that's where you see that, you know, while it sells many pairs of underwear, he might not be the most credible person about that quality, right? And that's a false use of authority. Okay, just one example. The next fallacy is a red herring. Okay, this one is again a favorite of conspiracy theorists. Notorious for false flags. It's the fallacy that gets people off track or distracted. Okay, it's a diversionary one. An example that, and you see this happen with journalists doing interviews. I've most certainly have personally experienced this one as a journalist before. But it's politicians and CEOs and people of authority and companies do this all the time to avoid answering the press. Okay, so an example of this would be if a CEO doesn't want to answer the press about outsourcing jobs, for instance, they would make a statement like, "You raise a good question about the support of companies outsourcing to find cheaper labor. Let me tell you about my admiration for the productivity of the American worker." So as you hear, the first part of the statement talked about the question, but then the second part changed the narrative to a different topic. Okay, and so they have effectively diverted that narrative to something they wanted to talk about to avoid something, right? And so that's what a red herring does, okay, is it misleads them into a different conversation. And this is the image on here is kind of a English grammar red herring. So if you can't win an argument, correct their grammar instead, right? So that's that tactic. Funny. The next one is hasty generalization, which is related to post hoc, which is after that. right? This is where someone bases a claim on insufficient data or unrepresentative data. You see this a lot, and I call this the stereotyping fallacy, because you see one person doing something, then all must be doing it, right? So there's no logical evidence or sufficient or unbiased evidence. Sometimes it's very stereotypical or biased. So an example that I thought about was when people drive a Ford with a Confederate flag on the back. You think about all Ford drivers, and they must all share those values and beliefs if they drive a Ford, when in reality that really must not be the case. There are drivers that drive Fords that don't subscribe to any of those attitudes and beliefs and values. Okay, so that's just how we make a hasty generalization or an assumption about somebody because they drive a Ford. Okay, and you see the mathematics in this image don't line up. 2 equals a number, 1 equals a number, 2 equals 1. It just doesn't add up. So that's where we become hasty with our assumptions. The next one, bandwagoning fallacy. This is the one where everyone is doing it, so you should do it. This fallacy plays on our pathos. It's about guilt and deception. And so when you look at this image advertised for McDonald's, you notice that the numbers are really skewed on here. It says over 99 billion served. And so everybody starts to think, well, how does that work? You know, eventually, if you really look closely. And so if you step back to think about it, you think, how does that add up when there's only 7.53 billion people on the planet in reality as of 2020, right? So we dig a little deeper, we look for that research, and we're just like, well, maybe the 99 billion are, you know, maybe it's about the transactions, right? Maybe it's not about the actual people count, and maybe it's the transactions, but I don't know. However, this 99 billion served is that bandwagoning fallacy because you feel guilty or pressured to wanting to be part of that, right? So, but again, step back and try to see that that's that persuasion or that influence, and it's not really that true, okay? And it's misleading. Missing the point fallacy is ignoring the conclusion, and it runs with just part of the conversation and shifts away from the original purpose. So you see in this comic, no, the bunny says, no, I'm serious. It's all over the news. The only evidence they have of Hitler's body is this busted skull, and they just found out it's actually from a young woman. Okay. And the dog replies, I can't believe it. Hitler was a chick. And the bunny says, I wonder sometimes why I even try to talk to you. So I'm sure we've had conversations like that with our friends and our parents or somebody, you know, that the conversation goes way over their head and they focus in on one part of the conversation and steer the conversation away. So that's missing the point fallacy. The next fallacy is ad misericordiam, okay? And ad misericordiam is, as it sounds, it's it's almost tongue twisting to say. And so that's how I remember that this is a twisting of the data and the facts, okay? This fallacy twists the data and the facts that are presented. You'll see this happening in courts, especially with the insanity plea. Like they didn't know what they were doing when they were murdered, right? When they were murdering someone. The lawyer is stating in the comic, how can you convict this man of murdering his mother? He's an orphan. And so it's exploiting people's feelings and moving them to pity or guilt. So it does, again, appeal to an emotion, but it twists the facts. Another example that I've encountered as a journalist, when you hear something like, GM employs so many good people, how can you believe that they would ever contaminate the soil? Okay, so it's twisting the facts and the nature of a person or character. The next fallacy is the false comparison analogy. And so when you're taking a look at this comic strip, it has a line of different animals. And it's counting on an implausible comparison between the animals that are presented in there, okay? It's stating a fair selection, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb a tree. And so when you're taking a look at this, you know that they're all mammals or animals, right? But we can't logically make that comparison for those animals because not all of them have that potential of climbing that tree, except for that monkey, right? And so it's silly to kind of compare all of those things. And we wouldn't normally do so, right? Because it's a deceitful or a trick, right? And you can't really compare that. One that we hear colloquially is we can't compare apples to oranges all the time. So yeah, the same thing, another example that I've talked about is you can't really compare like a real live mouse and a computer mouse, right? So though, you know, they have to be something that could be potentially functionally comparable. So that's the false comparison analogy. The next one is the tautological fallacy. This is where a fallacy, a person is arguing, excuse me, sorry. This is where a person is saying the same thing twice, okay? They look at the premise is what's stated twice. So in circular argument, you have the premise that is used in place for the conclusion. In tautological argument, you have the premise, and that is just stated twice for the premise and the conclusion. And so an example, politicians like to do this. George Bush was notorious for making tautological statements. When asked by a reporter, he made the statement, we have to go to war. And the reporter stated, well, why? And he said, because we need to attack Iraq. And so you hear that he has made that same statement twice in the premise and in the conclusion. He's just stated the same premise twice, that assertion twice. So in this comic strip, you hear, and you see, and we know mass creates gravity because dense planets have more gravity. How do we know which planets are more dense? They have more gravity. So they're saying that same thing twice. And he points out that's tautological reasoning. I prefer to think of it as having no loose ends, right? So, haha. Oops, went a little too far. The next fallacy is the composition fallacy. This, again, much like other fallacies, only considers part of the whole. So you see in the picture that the car is made of rubber, and that asks the viewer to believe that the whole car is made of rubber, right? When in fact, you know that it's made up of other components, right? So you couldn't argue that the whole thing was made of rubber because it's made of other components to help it function. Composition fallacy, there's this parable about truth and how truth is revealed, where there were 6 blindfolded people, and they were asked to touch different parts of an elephant, not knowing that it was an elephant, of course. They were led in to touch different parts of the elephant. And so one blindfolded person that was touching the husk thought that it was a rhinoceros. Another a person that was touching the tail thought it was a snake, and so on and so on. They all called out different animals. And so by only touching the part, they believed themselves to be right with their narrative and right with their truth, until they all took off their blindfold and were able to see the whole picture. And so the composition fallacy kind of relates to that story, and that sometimes when we only see part, we're not really getting that whole picture, okay? And so we think about that whole picture with composition fallacies that are made. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. That's a lot to say, isn't it? It stands for after this, therefore, because of this. Since Y follows the event X, event Y must have been caused by X, okay? In the picture, it shows I ate a loaf of bread and got a cold a few days later. I must have gotten sick from the bread I ate. There could be a number of variables that had caused the person to get sick. They just reductively put it on the loaf of bread, right? I get into a personal argument with my husband about, and I use this fallacy, post hoc ergo propter hoc. I don't drink pop very much, but when I do, I tend to break out. And so I tell my husband that I broke out because I drank the pop. When there could be so many other things that contributed. I could have touched my face. It might have been the skincare products that I've used. So many, and my hormones. There could have been so many different factors, but I will take it to the grave that it was that Pepsi that caused my zits. Okay, so and my husband said, well, come back and say that's post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, and I'll say no, there's data out there and I'll prove it. So it's a fun debate, but these things, exhibit or present themselves in our daily lives too. So that's that fallacy. Appeal to tradition fallacy. Okay, the appeal to tradition fallacy is the fallacy where because something is old, it must be better or true. You'll hear phrases like, it's always been that way, right? So we should go with that. And this one makes me think about this windy goat path story. So it was, there was a path that was created by a goat, and it was very, very windy. And eventually, villagers would walk this path, and as time went on, they paved it. And to travel this windy path, it took like an hour. And so people would still continue to take that paved windy path. And it just continued for a long time until one person stated, you know, if we built a straight road, it would only take one place to go from village to village. And so the response from all of the folks to that one person was, we've always taken this path. Why would we change that? And so they argued against it, right? So that's like an example of that appeal to tradition. And, you know, like in this picture, they've been doing the running of the bulls for a long time, and people will still do it even though it's stupid, right? So that's that appeal to that tradition and fallacy, right? And they could potentially be missing out on a better way. So the next fallacy is the appeal to ignorance. This fallacy counts on the lack of evidence to a contrary belief. And it also asks for the burden of proof to be placed on somebody else rather than the person that is arguing, okay? And so with this image, you can see you can't prove I'm not real, so I am. And it's a picture of a unicorn. And so they're asking you for the burden of proof to prove that that they're wrong, right? So that's what the appeal to ignorance is. It just asks you to prove me wrong. The last fallacy, and the one that's used more times than not with media, in people that make arguments, okay? And this one, I want to caution you, because you're working on your projects and creating your arguments. This fallacy is where people want to look glowing, want to look credible, and so they slant their arguments and their support, and they don't look for multiple viewpoints. And as you've heard us talk about, sometimes you can look in an echo chamber, okay? And so this fallacy does that. You only look for evidence that will support your own arguments or claims that you want to make. You don't look for those counter arguments. And so when you present your information to the reader or the audience, they'll start to poke holes and find gaps in your shaky foundation, and your argument will eventually fold or fall, okay? So you want to avoid doing the stacking of the deck fallacy. It's important to remember when you're researching that you're searching for the truth, not to be necessarily right. So make concessions. Look into that other side and make concessions. Maybe you are right on a few points and not in others, and that's okay, because we want to extend that conversation, right? In our discourse communities. And if it turns out that you are wrong in your search, then you have a new outlook that's based on truth, and that's what really should matter. So I hope you enjoyed the conversation about fallacies. I'm happy to answer any questions about them. I encourage you again to look on the internet and mine for some more. And I hope that you guys have a good week.